I understand that it does not do Matthew 28, 19, and 20 an injustice to interpret it as you go. Jesus said, "Go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations." And I'm told that you can translate that as you go. And I think that's good instruction for us because we are right here. This is where we live right now. This is where we move and where we have things to do. This afternoon, I'm going to be probably presenting more of our own journey as missionaries. And of course, you need to remember that God works with everyone differently. He knows you and He knows what you need. And He wants to work with your talents and your abilities. And so it's going to be quite a bit about what we have done. Northern Light Gospel Mission is where we were. And as I grew up, one thing that impressed me was that there were so many people, and actually living in a sparsely settled area and then moving back to this area. I think we think of that continually. There's everywhere you go, there's people. And being down in Haiti, even in the mountains, there's people everywhere. Just everywhere there's people. So how are we going to respond to the people around us? God has called us, and He calls you to His own service. I would like to just particularly thank the children for sitting quietly. And you know, when an old man gets up to talk, and sometimes it gets boring, you don't know what you're going to do. But thank you, children, for sitting quietly this morning and again this afternoon. It's a blessing. Can children be missionaries? Absolutely. And oftentimes children are missionaries. I'm reminded of it's kind of a long story, I won't go into it, but a missionary couple who went to Africa, and their only contact was a little boy from the village. The village didn't want them there. And this boy kept bringing them things from the village, and this missionary's wife taught this little boy about Jesus. As it happened, they had a baby, and the baby died. You may have heard the story. It was in a book called Aggie, and David and Svea flood. And after the baby died, his wife became sick and died, and David became very discouraged and got mad at God and moved back to Scotland, where he came from. And Aggie was a little older. His daughter, he couldn't take care of her, and he gave her to some other missionaries to take care of. And as things turned out, she eventually moved to the States and married a man from Minnesota who was working at a Bible school. And some years later, they were in England they had some business there, and they hadn't actually even planned to attend this missionary conference that was going somewhere in London. And there was a man from Africa who was speaking that evening. And she went up and talked, Aggie went up and talked to this man, and she asked him if he'd ever heard of Svea flood. His answer was, "She taught me about Jesus." That was the only contact. And from that contact, there were schools and hospitals and churches, because he had been faithful. And God calls us, and He wants to use what we have. God called us to Red Lake, Ontario, and that's a picture of the town of Red Lake. It's taken from the air from the northeast toward town, and oh my, you can't see it very well. I'm getting ahead of myself here. The mission house is on Main Street, about over in here. The highway coming in is off to the left here, and we were in Red Lake for 15 years. And during that time, we started a Sunday school in Ear Falls. And that became busier and busier, and in 75 we moved to Ear Falls. Many of you have heard quite a bit of our story. I was in Red Lake for a year and a half before Carolyn and I were married. She was attending nurses training in Fort Wayne at the time. And then we were married in July in 62, and she moved with me to Red Lake. So where is Red Lake, or where is Ear Falls? I have a bunch of extra things there, but if you can see it, there's Goshen, and the Great Lakes, and International Falls is right in here. I was going to put International Falls on there, but it kind of interfered with some other things. Red Lake is up here. Ear Falls is here. And from Red Lake to Goshen is about 1,000 miles, roughly 1,000 miles. People used to ask us, do you know so-and-so? He lives over by Toronto. Well, Toronto is over in here. And I had looked at one time, Toronto is farther from Ear Falls or Red Lake than Goshen is. So we were a lot closer here. This will show you a little bit better some of what was happening there. Here's Dryden. It looks like you can read it fairly well. Sandy Lake was our farthest north station. The mission was working with native reserves in the bush country. And at the time I went to Red Lake, about right here, the road went north through Ear Falls and on up to Red Lake, and that was the end of the road. Since then, there's been a number of logging roads that go here and there, and at one time, the only way to Red Lake was by the highway from Vermilion Bay, which is on the Trans-Canada Highway. Anymore, if you know the backwoods roads, the logging roads, you can get to Kenora from Red Lake without going there. At one time they'd talked about, because of a forest fire, they talked about an emergency road from Red Lake down to Winnipeg, Manitoba. We tell people that Winnipeg was our nearest big town, and we did a lot of the shopping for the mission in Winnipeg. The different state, Pikangikum was the nearest to Red Lake, Poplar Hill, Deer Lake, Sandy Lake, North Spirit Lake, Cat Lake, Slate Falls, and you all know Pickle Lake, that's where Harvey and Carolyn Hostetler are, and Osnaburg. Actually, a root portage dam that just happens to be there. I had marked it because I used to, when I was flying commercially, we used to fly Ontario Hydro out there. It's a water control dam, actually between Ear Falls and Pickle Lake. Pickle Lake itself is somewhat of a reservoir, as well as Lac Sewell, and Ear Falls is on the north end of Lac Sewell, and they actually made a river between the two, and the Root Portage Dam controls the water there. That's the only reason I've showed that. I went to Red Lake in January, actually, the 1st of January, 1961, and 42 below one morning soon after, and that was, I guess, a good introduction to the cold in Red Lake. I was with my daughter one time when I told somebody that they wondered how long we're going to be in the north, and I said, sometimes I think I've had enough of the cold, and my daughter laughed. She was about 30 years old at the time. She said, "You've been saying that as long as I can remember." We lived in the headquarters building, and this was the view out our kitchen window. This picture would have been taken about 1970. The first airplane there is a Pilatus Porter. The other two are Cessna 180s. The 180 was kind of a standard for bush operators who were starting an airline. A lot of people would start with a 180 Cessna and just fly freight for hire and get bigger and bigger, and eventually they had there were a number of small airlines operating there at the time. And this is the missions airplane flying skis in the wintertime over the bush country, and in summertime on floats. And float flying was a lot of fun. It was very interesting. I've said different times that God wants to use our abilities and things we like to do. That is normally true. I know that it's not always true. My mother used to say that if something had an engine on it, she could get me to do the job. And I'm afraid if it didn't have an engine, sometimes she had to work pretty hard to get me to do the job. That's no credit to me. But I always enjoyed mechanical things, and flying came right into that, and it seemed that God wanted to use that. The airplane here, an airplane is something to go fast, or something that people fly to have fun with. In the north, it's transportation. People wonder if you could go through the bush without an airplane, and yes, you could. But the native people used to take all spring to go from somewhere up north down to Sioux Lookout. They'd stay in Sioux Lookout for a couple months during the summertime, then they'd take a couple months to go back home again for the winter up north. So it is possible, but not very easily possible, and flying becomes the means of transportation. And the airplane is a workhorse up north. It's what you use to get everything in and out. And one thing I particularly enjoyed was external loads. They've changed the regulations a lot on those. It used to be that anything that we could tie on the outside, we would tie on the outside. There's a limit to that, of course. But here you see some water pipe that was in long lengths, and we didn't want to cut it to get it inside the airplane. It was very easy to put it on the outside, and I flew that north. I did have a coil of irrigation pipe that they needed at Poplar Hill one time, and it fit underneath the airplane between the floats, and actually I put that on the Pilatus. But for legal purposes, for weight and balance purposes, you double the weight of anything you tie on the outside. And that didn't weigh very much. It was just irrigation pipe. And I had a little bit inside, but not much. But there was so much drag that the airplane climbed right up to about 50 feet, then it didn't want to climb anymore. And I flew. It was about 12 miles to the far side of Red Lake. The way we crossed it, Red Lake itself was about 25 or 30 miles long. And by the time I reached the far shore, going toward Poplar Hill, I still didn't have 500 feet, and we wanted to have 500 feet altitude before we headed out over the bush. So I turned and headed down the lake a ways and kept trying to get it to climb, and finally I did have 500 feet, but I don't think I was over 700 feet the whole way to Poplar Hill. So external loads can get quite interesting sometimes, but a lot of things we could get in the airplane. You can't see it very well, but that's a generator for one of the bush stations. I'm not actually sure exactly where that went, but what we could get inside, we would put inside. I remember I had gotten a toolbox before I went north, and somebody said, "Well, you can't fly that in the airplane, can you? It's too heavy." Well, that's a matter of how big the airplane is. You can put an awful lot of heavy things in airplanes. And I mentioned that a lot of people started small with Bush Airlines and ended up getting bigger and bigger. And this is Ontario Central Airlines, which started exactly that way in Kenora, and then they had a number of other bases. And they were based in Red Lake. And you know how children play sometimes. The boys at Poplar Hill somebody had given the young schoolboys, they had given some trucks to play with. I think it was for Christmas gifts or something. And these boys would take these trucks and run them through the air, and they'd say, "This is my OCA." It's just kind of an interesting thing. They know what they learn with. The natives, someone had said that the mission was like a foreign mission on home soil. And to quite an extent that was true. One spring, Carolyn and I went to McDowell Lake to live with the natives. It was just while the missionaries were gone. I think it might have been a week or two. I don't remember that it was over 2 weeks. But they were drying meat at the time that we were up there, and that's the way they used to preserve their meat. in order to store it. And there's naturally a lot of things that have changed over the years. I don't know if they would do this at all anymore. And also here's a grandma with her grandchildren. We had the thing that the baby is in is a Tikanagan, and we had one for our oldest daughter for a little while. It's very handy. They're bundled right in there, and they behave very nicely in there. The native people used to use moss for diapers, and for a while we had quite a group of nurses, and they would get together every year for a nurses' conference, and I heard them discussing one year whether the babies that used moss ever had diaper rash. And they said, no, they don't get diaper rash if you use moss. Interesting. One of the things that I really enjoyed doing during that time was it was all mission-related flying. But occasionally I would take some of the native ministers for a preaching tour, normally on weekends, sometimes during the week. The man just to the left of me, oops, I'm sorry. I get the wrong button here all the time. The man just to the left of me is Magnus James. He was an old Indian patriarch, a Christian man, and I was always impressed with him. Sometimes they would preach on and on and on, and I don't know that I ever really got tired of it. Maybe if I were honest with myself, I'd have to say I did sometimes. I couldn't understand it because they were speaking the Indian language, but often after a service, a lot of the people would just sit around and talk. And Magnus was a man who was he was a magnet for the Christian life. He would explain something, and he'd jabber away, and then he'd laugh. He had an infectious laugh, and somebody'd ask him a question, and he'd explain it, and he'd be talking away, and then he'd laugh. And I always appreciated Magnus James. The man beside him is Aglaba James. That's his son, and his son also was a preacher for quite a number of years. After we were in Ear Falls, Magnus came to visit one time. And he came with Henry Hostetler from Red Lake. Henry knew the native language very well. He worked with translation, and he knew the mechanics of the language very well. After Magnus was in Ear Falls, he wrote me a letter. And I don't know if I could lay my hands right on it, but I still have it. Was a real letter of encouragement. He reminded me of something that I'd forgotten. He was flying with me one day, and I asked him if he wanted to fly. And so he took we had the right side controls in at the time, and he took the controls, and he kind of did some of the flying, and he referred to that. And then he said, when we're in ministry for God, it's a little bit like that. God sometimes gives us the controls, but He's right there to take over if we need Him there. And to me, it was just a real encouragement. We did occasionally for a number of years. We tried about once a month to go it was kind of over the hill, about 15 minutes flying time from Red Lake to Trout Lake. There was a family there. He was a fisherman. He was Norwegian and she was native. And this is their family. We'd go out on a Sunday afternoon and have a service with them. And just a very unique family. They taught their children at home for a number of years, and then they sent them out to Red Lake or Kenora for school. And they were quite a delight to be with. They had a number of orphan moose over a period of time that would come around to their camp on Trout Lake. And this was a pair of twins that they managed to rescue. That they were orphaned, and they raised them until they were bigger. And they had different stories to tell about moose that would sometimes come around. They had the first moose they had was a bull moose named Pete that they had raised from a young moose, and they they had several of them, and they would have quite the stories to tell about these moose. It's quite interesting. This is a picture of Deer Lake Village. That's 110 miles north of Red Lake. The mission house is actually on the other side of the lake. The village is all along here, and now things are changed quite a bit. About over here, about 6 or 8 miles now, there's an airport, and sometimes people tend to move out toward the airport. If they build an airport, they have to go find a level place. The government has built quite a number of airports, and I think basically probably all the reserves have airports by this time. When I first went north, Pikangikum and Sandy Lake were the only ones that had airports. And once in a while, you run across something like this. This is one of the Cessnas at Cat Lake on glassy water. Glassy water is an interesting phenomenon. When you're landing on glassy water, you can't see it, and you go ahead and land anyway. But the problem is that you think you can see it and you can't, and that can be fatal. But you have to set up a glide at a shallow angle of descent, and you glide in with power until you touch down. And if you have your approach set up right, as quick as you touch down, you pull the power back, you make a wonderful landing. But if you think you're too far above it, you can smack onto it, and an airplane will bounce on floats. And if you think it's way down below you, you can fly into it, and that's just as bad. And sometimes the airplane will even upset. You don't want that to happen. But it's a very interesting thing. I enjoyed glassy water landings, but naturally you can't do it on a short lake. You have to have room to stretch out your glide. This is the mission at Sandy Lake. And, I don't know if I ever really thought about it before I put this picture on here. I don't know if there was ever glassy water on Sandy Lake because it was always muddy. They told us that it was clear, it was clean in the springtime when the ice went out, but in just a couple days with a wind coming up, it would stir up the bottom and it would get very muddy and you couldn't see into the water at all. They filtered the water there naturally that they were going to drink. And many of you have seen this picture before. Sometimes you have to use your ingenuity. They had a fire on that airplane, managed to get it out. And Whitey and I flew in, and Whitey got the idea that it was cold enough he could put bed sheet on it and put water on the bed sheet, and it would work to fly it out to repair it. I don't know if you can tell it very well. There's damage on the wing as well. And we put bed sheet over both wings and by the door. And we flew it to Red Lake, and then a couple days later we flew it to International Falls where we could pull it in a hangar. We didn't have the hangar at Red Lake yet, and finished repairing it. And it was sometime during this time in 1966 that the mission asked us one day, would you be interested in starting a Sunday school in Ear Falls? Several people in Ear Falls had been asking for a Sunday school. We'd been having Bible school there almost ever since the mission had been in Red Lake. They started in 1952. And the Bible schools in the summertime were one of the big things as far as the ministry was concerned. And so we'd been having Bible schools in Ear Falls, but they hadn't had a Sunday school. So Carolyn and I, along with some young folks, started going to Ear Falls on Sunday, and we had Sunday school for 2 years. Then we started having a preaching service. This is one of the very first Sundays in Ear Falls. We met in the Canadian Legion Hall, and a lot of times we would stack tables and clean up beer cans from the night before and clean things up and set up chairs so that we could have Sunday school. Missionary work is not always easy. Sometimes there are things that happen that you just don't quite understand. And I debated quite a while before I decided. The next couple pictures I've never shown publicly. But you've probably heard about it. In 1966, right at the time we started the church in Ear Falls, I made a trip from Red Lake to Poplar Hill to North Spirit Lake and back to Red Lake. And I was in the air going to North Spirit, to Poplar Hill, before they called me on the radio and wondered if I had enough of fuel to go from Poplar Hill up to North Spirit and then back to Red Lake again. And I checked the fuel, and I had enough of fuel. But one of the common practices in the bush, and I thought it was in the operator's manual for the airplanes, it turned out it was not. But so that you know how much fuel you have, you switch to one tank, the tank in each wing, and you switch to one tank so that you can run that tank dry, because some of the fuel is only usable in level flight. So that way you get more out of the fuel on the one side, and then you have the fuel in the other side. Well, I went to North Spirit Lake and was on my way back. I just passed Coley Lake, about 10 minutes out of Red Lake, when the engine stopped, and I switched over to the other side. The tank on the other side was about half full, but for some reason it didn't take fuel from the other side. And I turned around right away to see if I could make it back to Coley Lake, because I had just passed it. I saw right away that I wasn't going to make it back to Coley Lake. So I'd always been told, if you have to land in the bush, you pick the thickest trees you can find, and the thick trees will break your fall and slow down the landing. And I used to kid Whitey, Whitey Hostetler was our mechanic at the time. I used to kid him that I would make a landing in the thickest trees I could find and climb out of the airplane, and then there'd be a lake right there. Well, there wasn't a lake right there, but I did land in the trees. It's not something I would want to do again, but it was a good experience. Just before I started hitting the trees, I said, Lord, it's up to you. And I didn't know what was going to happen. The thought did go through my mind, hey, you could get hurt here. But I didn't get hurt, fortunately. It was the Lord's protection. And what do you do when you have an airplane 1.5 miles from the nearest lake down in the trees like that? Well, we took a crew out from Red Lake. They got the airplane out of the trees, cut a clearing around it, and then actually they took the wings and the tail off. From the trees, the leading edge of the wing was beat in a bit, and the tail was beat in a bit, and the propeller was bent. So they took the propeller and the wings off and the tail and flew them out to Red Lake to repair them. In the meantime, they started pulling the airplane out. They cut a trail 1.5 miles wide enough for the floats. Several places they had to go up a hill, and they winched it there. It was very slow going, a couple of inches at a time. But by the time the airplane was back out at the lake, they had the wings and the tail ready, so they flew those back out and put the airplane back together and flew it out to Red Lake to finish repairing it. And this was in 1966. And you know, you really have to wonder about things like that. It was right during the time that we started the Sunday school in Ear Falls, and I've been impressed that a lot of times our spiritual battle takes very physical attributes. And was Satan trying to discourage us? I don't know. Maybe I should have responded differently. Maybe we should have done things differently. We do wonder, but we do know that God is over all. And then in 1973, a couple from Pennsylvania by the name of Lee and Genevieve Martin had moved into Ear Falls. And to this day, we have been very, very grateful for their contribution there. And I wonder how often I wish that people would just move into the community and live there and be a testimony. And that's, as God works in your heart, maybe that's something He wants you to do. Not to even be a preacher or a mission leader, but just to go somewhere and be a testimony. But one Saturday, the Bible school teachers were going to be soliciting. We usually solicited for Bible school on Saturday before we started Bible school on Monday. And Lee and Genevieve Lee had a cousin who was going to be coming to help with Bible school, and they were flying into International Falls. And Lee and I were going to go down and pick them up. And we were landing in Ear Falls Saturday forenoon, and just over that railroad bridge, there's a set of, it wasn't power lines, it was private telephone lines. Ear Falls provides electric power for Pickle Lake and for Red Lake. And this was private telephone line, a line that the Hydro had going from Ear Falls to Pickle Lake. 2 of them were 1/4-inch cable, and there were 4 other wires. The cables, one cable tore at one end, the other cable tore at the other end, and they wrapped around the airplane. And actually, I think what happened is that they slowed us down, that we stalled onto the water. And that was after the airplane was pulled back up on shore. And again, you have to wonder, why did this happen? And what's with it all? Is God testing our dedication? And interestingly, the repair, they debated for a while whether the airplane was repairable. Oftentimes the question is it repairable for what it will cost, rather than just replacing it? And they decided to repair it. It cost $40,000. In 1973, that was a lot more money than now. There was a widow lady from northern Indiana that sent $10,000 for that. The widow's mite, even though that time it wasn't just a mite. But we really appreciated that. And I don't know if that was during this time, but often when the Bible school teachers would come, we would take tours of the local industry. This is out at a logging camp, and I don't know if you can recognize Alvin Miller on the far right there. He and his wife came up several years to have charge of the Bible school in Ear Falls. We appreciated their contribution very much. This was at a logging camp, and another industry was Griffith Iron Mine just north of Ear Falls. As you can see, they had pretty big equipment. In the background there are some ore trucks. They started with 65-ton trucks, and soon they went to 75-ton trucks, and later on they went to 90-ton trucks. And these trucks are huge, but they're very boxy. And I'm told that they're almost helpless on snow. And they had an open pit mine there, and they had a driveway down to the bottom of the mine. They drive these down to the bottom of the mine and then back up. But if it snowed, they had to clean off the snow and then sand the road because they couldn't use them very well. This is also at Griffith Mine, and that was one of the main industries. And it was during this time that things kept getting busier and busier. And we had thought, when Lee and Genevieve moved in, at one time we thought the Lord was calling us to move to Ear Falls. And we considered it. At one time I told my brother that you have to realize that you're not indispensable. At the same time, you have to realize that you know things that take time and expense to acquire. And I knew the bush fairly well. I knew the flying end quite well. And so, we kind of wondered, should we give up the flying? And then it seemed, and I feel like we assessed this honestly, that at that time the Lord wanted our willingness. And we'd finally said that we would go if that's what the Lord wanted. And then Lee and Genevieve moved in, and I just figured that Lee would take over the ministry at the church there, but he preferred to work in the community. He was a real businessman, and he came from a family of business people, and he eventually started an auto parts store in Ear Falls. He did a number of things before that, but after he had this auto parts store, I thought often, only heaven will reveal the good that he did in that store. People would stop in the store just to talk. And Lee was excellent at he would have been a personnel manager. He was very good at discussing things with people, but then because he didn't want to take over leading the mission in Ear Falls again, it just seemed like the Lord was calling us to that. And it was during this time that I was up north one day. I was trying to decide what we should do. We had been doing an awful lot of flying at the time. They were building at Poplar Hill, and there were days that I would get up early and make a trip to Poplar Hill before breakfast, and then I'd stop in for breakfast and fly there the rest of the day. And that may have been some of a contributing factor to us deciding to move. But one day, while I was puzzling this and trying to decide what to do, I was up north, and a fellow missionary took me to Isaiah 58. And that was kind of a driving force for me for a number of years. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and to bring the homeless poor into your house when you see the naked to cover him and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you take the yoke from your midst, the pointing finger and the speaking wickedness, if you pour out yourself for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom be as the noonday. And the Lord shall guide you continually and satisfy your desire in scorched places, and make your bones strong, and you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. And your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable. If you honor it, not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And consequently, we did move to Ear Falls. Ear Falls is a very small town. The pictures of Griffith Mine started up in 1968, just soon after we started the Sunday school, and Griffith Mine employed quite a few people in town. Right at the same time, another mine started at South Bay, 50 miles northeast of Ear Falls. And a lot of the people that worked there stayed in Ear Falls. So the Ear Falls went from a town of about 1,000 or 1,100 to a town of, I think at one time there were 2,200 people there. And that's the way it was about the time we moved there. That was in 1975, and the mission bought a property, and we moved the house off of that and built another house, and that's our family right at the time that we moved in 1975. This is a picture of Ear Falls taken from the south. That's the main part of Ear Falls, and we always had a great appreciation for the people of Ear Falls. They were very, very welcoming people, very congenial people. And we had about 75 people coming to church during those years, even in the Legion Hall. This is a snowstorm in Ear Falls, just after a snowstorm in Ear Falls. We had 18 inches in one weekend that time. And things developed. The mission wanted us to build a church building, and we couldn't seem to find property for it. We would suggest something, and the town would turn it down, or the town would suggest something, and it didn't fit our needs. And finally, in about 1980, we acquired a property just north of town, and build a church in the summer of 1981. That's the building under construction. And this is the interior of Ear Falls Chapel. I've often wondered, is it a good thing? I think it's a good thing. I've noticed that when we come into church here, you folks are sitting and everything's quiet. Seems like everybody's meditating about what's going to happen or what has happened. One day I walked into church 15 minutes before church was to start, and I said to a friend of mine, look here. I looked in the back door of the church there, and people were sitting there. Probably 85 or 90% of the people that were coming to church were there, and they were just sitting in there quietly. It doesn't happen a lot of places. I don't know that there's any particular merit in that, but I think it's good to quiet oneself before the Lord and get ready to worship. In 1982, we started a Christian school. We used the ACE curriculum, Accelerated Christian Education, and this is actually it's a worldwide organization anymore. At the time it started, it was nationwide and into Canada. And they had a convention every year where the students could enter in different categories. They had some sports categories, but that started kind of slowly. Most of it was needlework. They had a category of preaching, and anybody, it was a contest. Anybody who entered in preaching, or they had a lot of memory work. You could memorize the book of Psalms. Can you imagine that? Or the book of Proverbs, or the epistles. All of the epistles. Seems like a lot, but anybody who entered the convention in memory work that had memorized their work got a first place. And I thought that was very good. The year that we went, this particular year, that we were there with our students, we got, I think, we got two first places in needlework and first place in electrical technology and several second place. And we thought that was pretty good for a little school. We had 22 students at any one time. I think one year we had 25 enrolled, but some came and some went. I had a problem becoming a preacher. I didn't want to become a preacher. I fought it. I generally have not had a big problem getting up in front of people and talking, but I don't know, for some reason I just didn't want to be a preacher. And I feel like God used that, but I did want to get to know the people and to work among the people and get to see their needs and see what they were doing. And so I started taking on part-time work and worked for a small company that was building roads in the bush. And one summer I worked for the town in charge of the Ear Falls Airport. I did a number of things over several years, and in 1988, I started flying for Lac Seul Airways, which was one of the main small airlines just south of Ear Falls. It was an air taxi service, and they had their own fishing camps out in the bush. And at one time, we had a professional photographer in camp, and he took this picture. He also took another picture just before this or just after it, that he entered into a national photo contest and won a national photo contest with it. This picture appeared on the, I don't know if any of you are acquainted with Orvis. They make sporting goods clothing. This was men's clothing. This picture was on the cover of their men's clothing catalog one year. But you can see the tail of one airplane. The other airplane is over here. You can kind of see it. We parked the airplanes on buoys because we had about 4 miles to the east of open water. And an airplane on floats needs to be facing into the wind. If it's tailed into the wind, the water will lap over the back of the floats, and they seep enough water that the back compartment will fill, and then the next compartment will fill, and every once in a while you see an airplane that sinks overnight because they were tailed into the wind. But on a buoy, an airplane will always weathercock into the wind. So we had our airplanes parked on buoys, and I would take the canoe out in the morning and tie the canoe to the buoy and bring the airplane to the dock and use it for the day. And so that's me on the way to work there. And this is one of the airplanes that we used. We also sold minnows to the fishermen, and the business was a part of the airline service. I always enjoyed minnow trapping. It was a little bit like farming. You'd get out early in the morning before the wind came up, and you'd go into the smaller lakes where we had our traps set, and you'd taxi around the lake shore and pick up the traps and dump the minnows into a bucket. And it was just interesting work. But this was probably my favorite airplane. Somebody called it an old friend, and I put in quite a few hours in that airplane. One thing that intrigued me, I don't know if you can see it up there, that strobe light is lit. You know how long a strobe light stays lit? It just happened that the photographer's camera shutter was open when he snapped the picture, and the strobe light was on. I thought that was kind of unique. But that airplane is probably also why my wife has trouble hearing me sometimes. They are very, very noisy. The pilot and co-pilot sit about so far from each other, and if you want to talk, you holler at the top of your voice, and you still say, "What?" They say you can always tell an autopilot because he says, "Eh?" Anyway, I enjoyed that airplane very much. It has 600 horsepower and hauls about 2,400 pounds, depending on your load inside. And also the Beaver. A lot of you have seen that picture before. But that's flying an external load. We had a neighbor there at Laxul Airways who wanted us to fly some picture windows. He actually had a Twin Beach, a fairly big airplane, and he couldn't get these picture windows into his Twin Beach, and he couldn't fly them on the outside. But we could tie them on the outside of the Otter, the other one. And so we tied them on the outside, and I went up to his place, and I came in for a landing over an island, and all at once my airspeed dropped off. I don't know exactly what happened, but I got the nose down right away and landed and unloaded, and we had 2 of them to haul. And the next trip I was prepared for it, but exactly the same thing happened. It must have been something about the lay of the land, and it kind of scared me, really, but it worked out okay, fortunately. Air Falls Chapel is just off of Highway 105 on the way to Red Lake, and this is a fairly recent sign. We put the posts in for the sign, but we had a different sign there for a number of years. This sign's just been up for the last couple of years, and that's Air Falls Chapel today. The building, that is. The church is scattered all throughout the area. And that's all the pictures. So I guess my challenge to you is go where God has called you, and let's see if we can. Oh, well, you can look at that for a while if you want to. Remember that God has a calling on your life, and He wants you to fill that calling. He has a race for you to run, and He wants you to run that race. Let's pray yet. Father, we thank you so much for your goodness and your mercies and your care. Thank you for the message that you have given us for the world around us, a message of life, a message of words, a message of kindness, a message of deeds. And we pray that you would work in our lives, that we would be obedient to your call, and that we would honor you in all that you have before us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now, I don't know if there's anything else yet. Do you want to?
Is the school, the boys' school at
You're talking about, that's right, I should have asked for questions. Thank you. Are you talking about what we used to call the Indian school?
Yeah.
You know, interestingly, I didn't know it until sometime later, but that school was started because the government didn't teach the Indian children.
I was up there around 1976, I was up there.
Okay, I don't know actually if that school is still going or not. I don't think that, the reason for it is no longer there.
And there was a girls' school too. I think that was at Beaverly.
And Dryden has a number of schools. That whole thing with the boarding schools particularly became kind of a sore spot. I didn't realize it until a number of years later, but the government actually would have we never did it, but the government would have the commercial pilots fly into a reserve, and of course when the airplane comes in, people all come. And the pilots would get a number of children up into the airplane and close the door and fly off to boarding school, and the parents didn't even know that the children left until they were gone. And the whole boarding school thing blew up in the middle 90s, or just in the late 80s. There had been some abuse at some of the boarding schools. I think I can safely say that never happened at any of the schools that Northern Youth Programs operated, or any of the schools that the mission operated. Although sometimes people misunderstand discipline methods and can call it abuse. But there was quite a furor over that when some of these native students started becoming older, and actually some of them became lawyers and started taking some of these schools to court. And that's why the mission school at Poplar Hill closed down, really. And it was not because of the school at Poplar Hill. It was basically because of the boarding school movement in general. But anymore, the government has fairly modern school at these reserves, although again, most of the time they're not teaching biblical values. The mission school at Poplar Hill first started because some of the people at McDowell Lake wanted their children to have a Christian education. And it started with just a very few students. I think there were only 8 or 10 students the first year I was up there. And almost all of them came from McDowell Lake. And they came from Christian parents who wanted their children to have a Christian education. And then in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, maybe early 70s, the government asked the mission if they would staff and operate the school, if they would fund it and supply the children. And so the mission started taking children from other reserves that weren't necessarily from Christian homes. And I think the school generally was a success, although there were some things about it that some people kind of objected to. They didn't want the students speaking Indian, and I'm not sure what all was involved with it. But the main reason that the school shut down was not because of the Poplar Hill School, but because of the boarding schools in general in northwestern Ontario. Maybe somebody has another question.
You mentioned Alvin Miller. What Alvin Miller?
From Milford?
Oh, okay. So,
yeah.
That's what I wondered, if that was the Alvin Miller.
That's right. It was he. Okay, well, thank you very, very much. Thank you for your attention. And I have to say, go with God. You're dismissed.